The new VP of operations walked into my office on a Tuesday morning and told me my processes were Dinosaur logistics. He was 33 years old. He had an MBA from Wharton and had never once managed a warehouse floor in his life. I nodded. I said, okay. I did not tell him that the distribution network he was about to optimize had been designed by me, rebuilt by me after the 2019 flood wiped out 2 of our regional hubs, and that buried in my original consulting agreement, signed 11 years before he ever heard of this company, was a clause that said exactly what happened to all of it if they ever let me go without 60 days written notice. I just said, okay, and went back to my desk and pulled out the folder I had kept in the bottom drawer for exactly this kind of moment. I had been in supply chain for 22 years. I started loading trucks at a regional distributor outside Columbus when I was 24, worked my way up through operations management, and eventually built a consulting practice that specialized in mid-size manufacturers with messy, legacy distribution problems, companies that had been doing things the same way since 1987 and didn't know why their margins kept shrinking. I was good at it. Not famous, not on any lists, just consistently good in the way that keeps the phone ringing. The company, I'll call them what they were, a mid-size industrial parts manufacturer outside of Detroit, brought me in 8 years ago on a project basis. I was supposed to spend 6 months restructuring their outbound logistics. 6 months turned into 2 years. 2 years turned into a full-time role as Director of Supply Chain Operations. I kept my consulting entity active. My attorney, when we structured the employment agreement, had insisted on it. He was careful like that. You're going in as an employee, he told me, but you're bringing your systems with you. We need to make sure that's protected. The clause was in Section 9 of my original consulting agreement, which predated my employment contract and was explicitly referenced within it. If my engagement was terminated by the company without 60 days written notice, all proprietary methodologies, routing frameworks, and demand forecasting models I had developed reverted to my consulting entity. Full stop. The company's in-house attorneys had reviewed it when I transitioned to staff. They had approved it. They probably didn't read it carefully. People rarely do when things are going well. Things were going well for a long time. Then the private equity firm bought them. PE acquisitions have a particular smell to them, not immediately. At first it's all town halls and we're excited about the platform and promises about culture. You learn to watch for the second wave. The second wave is when the new operating partners start showing up with their frameworks and their dashboards and their guys. The guys are always young, always credentialed, always completely certain that whatever the company was doing before them was inefficient by definition. Inefficiency is how they justify their fees. My new VP, his name was Croft, I'll use that, it's not his real name, was their guy. He'd been installed 3 months after the acquisition closed. He had a background in e-commerce fulfillment. Fulfillment centers are not the same as industrial distribution. The lead times are different. The customer relationships are different. The consequences of a missed delivery when you're shipping decorative pillows versus when you're shipping replacement parts to a manufacturer running a production line are not remotely the same. I tried to explain this to him in our first meeting. He wrote something in his notebook and moved on. Over the next 4 months, Croft systematically introduced himself to every member of my team, reframed every initiative I had running as a legacy approach, and began CCing the new COO on emails where he summarized my explanations of our processes as resistance to modernization. I watched it happen with the kind of tired recognition you develop after enough years in corporate environments. I had seen this before. I knew what it was. It was a paper trail. The call came on a Thursday at 4:15 p.m. HR. The COO. Croft was not on the call, which told me everything. He had done his work and stepped back. That's how it's done. The HR director used words like restructuring and new strategic direction, and your role has evolved beyond the current organizational needs, which is the corporate way of saying we are replacing you with someone who will not push back on the new guy. They offered me a separation package, 30 days pay. They said my last day would be the following Friday. I let them finish. Then I said, I'll need to review everything with my attorney before I sign anything. There was a pause. HR said that was completely understandable. I hung up, opened my bottom drawer, took out the folder, and called my attorney. His name is not important. He's been practicing employment and contract law in Michigan for 30 years. He has a voice like he's always slightly amused by how predictable people are. When I read him the termination notice they'd emailed while we were still on the phone, He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They gave you less than 60 days written notice." "They gave me 8 business days." Another pause. "I'll pull the agreement." I already had it in front of me. Section 9, paragraph 2. If engagement is terminated by the company without provision of 60 calendar days written notice, all proprietary systems including but not limited to routing methodologies, forecasting frameworks, and operational documentation developed in whole or in part by consultant shall revert to and become the exclusive property of consultant's entity. "That's the clause," I said. "Yes, it is," he said. Here is what Croft and the new COO did not know, and what the PE firm's due diligence team had apparently not caught, and what the in-house attorneys had apparently filed away and forgotten. The distribution network I had built was not generic best practices assembled from industry playbooks. It was proprietary. The demand forecasting model I had built over 3 years, incorporating the specific company's customer behavior, their seasonal patterns, their carrier relationships, their warehouse layout, their particular mix of SKUs, that model didn't exist anywhere else. The routing logic I had developed for their 8 regional distribution points, which had reduced their freight costs by 23% over 4 years, was documented in a system architecture I had written. The operational manuals, the carrier negotiation frameworks, the exception handling protocols. I had written all of it. It was mine, legally, the moment they handed me a termination notice without 60 days. There's a thing that happens when you realize leverage. Not excitement exactly, more like a deep calm. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that night while my wife made dinner and just reading through the clause again, slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you understand exactly what it says. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I thought it was going to be okay. She knew what that meant for me. She said, "How okay?" I said, "Possibly very okay." My attorney spent the weekend reviewing the agreement in full, cross-referencing it with the employment contract, checking the state law implications. He called me Sunday evening. He was even more amused than usual. "The employment contract doesn't supersede the consulting agreement," he said. "It references it. That reference makes the consulting agreement's terms binding as incorporated. They essentially confirmed the clause when they hired you full-time. So it holds. It holds. And there's more." He paused in the way he does when the news gets better. "The forecasting model, is it currently running in their production environment? It's the backbone of their entire demand planning operation. And they'll continue using it after your termination. They don't have anything else. It'll take them 6 to 9 months minimum to build a replacement, assuming they can even find someone who understands their SKU complexity. So they need a license," he said, "or they're in breach of my IP rights every day they run it." Yes, that's exactly right. My attorney sent the letter on Monday morning at 8:47 a.m. It was not aggressive in tone. That's the thing about a letter that has the facts entirely on its side. It doesn't need to be aggressive. It was precise. It outlined the clause. It noted the date and manner of termination. It established that, as of the effective date of my separation, ownership of the specified proprietary systems had reverted to my consulting entity under the terms of the agreement. It invited them to discuss licensing arrangements. It included a preliminary valuation of the systems based on documented cost savings and estimated replacement costs. The figure was $1.4 million for a 2-year license. Or they could purchase the IP outright for $2.3 million. I heard the COO's reaction secondhand through a former colleague who was still on the inside. Apparently, he called it an extortion attempt. His in-house counsel called him back within the hour to explain that it was not an extortion attempt, it was a contract enforcement claim, and that the clause was binding and that they needed to get outside counsel involved immediately. They got outside counsel involved immediately. Outside counsel called my attorney the following Wednesday. The conversation, as my attorney described it to me, went through the predictable stages. First, they questioned whether the clause was enforceable. My attorney walked them through why it was. Then they questioned whether the systems truly qualified as proprietary under the definition in the agreement. My attorney walked them through the documentation. Then there was a long pause, and the other attorney said they would need to take this back to their client. Croft, I was told, was insistent that the systems were generic logistics infrastructure and that any competent operations team could replicate them within a few weeks. A COO apparently agreed with him for about 48 hours until their new operations team actually tried to work with the demand forecasting model and realized they couldn't interpret half of it without the documentation, which was also mine. This is the thing about institutional knowledge. It doesn't look complicated from the outside. It looks like a spreadsheet or a software interface or a process flow on a whiteboard. The complexity is in every judgment call that went into building it, every workaround for a quirk in the customer base, every adjustment made after a failure. You can look at the output and think it's simple. You cannot replicate it without understanding the inputs. 3 weeks after my termination, their regional fill rate started dropping. Their largest customer, a Tier 1 automotive supplier, began flagging missed delivery windows. This was not me doing anything. This was simply what happens when you remove the person who built and maintained the system and ask people who don't understand it to keep running it. My former colleague texted me a photo of the operations dashboard. I did not respond, but I did feel something. My wife asked me during that period if I was going to go back. She meant as a consultant. She was not asking because she thought I should. She was asking because she knew how I'd been treated and she wanted to see what I was going to do with it. I said I was going to wait and see what they offered. They called my attorney 5 weeks after the termination. They did not want to pay the licensing fee. They definitely did not want to pay $2.3 million to purchase the IP. What they wanted was for me to come back as a consultant on a contract to support the transition to whatever system they were going to build to replace mine. I want to be honest about what I felt when my attorney told me this. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired in the way that comes after a long fight, even if the fight was mostly waiting. And I felt something that was close to pity for Croft because I had been in enough organizations to know he had probably already been told by his PE overlords that this situation was his fault and that he needed to fix it. And here he was, trying to fix it by bringing back the person he had just fired. I told my attorney what my consulting rate would be. It was $850 an hour with a $40,000 retainer paid up front, non-refundable for the first engagement phase. This was not negotiable. There was a period of back and forth. They countered. My attorney politely declined the counter and restated the terms. They pushed back on the retainer. My attorney noted that given the circumstances of my separation and the IP situation, the terms reflected appropriate market positioning. They eventually agreed. I will not say I walked back into that building feeling nothing. The lobby looked the same. The receptionist smiled at me like I'd never left. I badged in with a visitor pass. My employee badge had of course been deactivated, and rode the elevator up to the 4th floor, and I was calm in the way you are. Calm when you know exactly where you stand. Croft was not in the building that day. I heard later he'd had a scheduling conflict. I suspect the scheduling conflict was intentional on his part. I was not there to see him, and he knew it. The COO met with me for about 20 minutes. He was polite. He was the particular kind of polite that happens when someone realizes they made a significant mistake and is trying to be gracious about it, which I respected more than if he'd been defensive. We talked about the scope of the engagement. I was there to help their team understand the architecture of the systems, document the knowledge gaps, and set them up to build a functional replacement over time. Not to fix everything, not to go back to what it was, just to give them a path forward. I worked with them for 3 months. The retainer covered the first phase. I billed the second phase at rate. The total came to just over $190,000 for my consulting entity, plus the IP licensing arrangement, which my attorney had structured as a 12-month license at a negotiated rate of $680,000 while they built out their replacement capability. That's just under $900,000 total. For being fired without proper notice. I had a conversation with my attorney toward the end of the engagement. I asked him, in retrospect, whether he thought I should have fought harder, pushed for the full $2.3 million, refused to come back at all, made them acquire the IP outright. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "You could have. The clause would have held, but they would have fought it for 2 years. The business would have deteriorated, and you'd have spent those 2 years in litigation instead of doing this. Sometimes the right number is the number that ends the problem." I thought about that for a long time after. The thing I keep coming back to is not the money. The money is real and it matters, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It matters a great deal. especially when you've spent 8 years building something and been handed a separation notice and a 40-minute phone call. But what stays with me is the moment in my kitchen, reading Section 9 for the third time, when I understood that I had protected myself without knowing I'd ever need to, not as a move, not as a scheme, just as a professional who had a good attorney and read his contracts carefully 11 years ago. Croft called my processes Dinosaur logistics. He wasn't entirely wrong. I use older methodologies where older methodologies work better, and I'm not ashamed of it. What he was wrong about was thinking that older meant fragile. What he was wrong about was thinking that the person who built the system was interchangeable with the system. I am not a sentimental person about corporate environments. I learned a long time ago that loyalty as a professional value is something you extend to your work, not to an org chart. You protect your work. You document your work. You make sure when you bring something valuable into an organization that you understand exactly what happens to that value if the relationship ends badly. I now include a version of that clause in every consulting agreement I sign. My attorney has updated the language to be even more precise. Several colleagues have asked me about it after hearing what happened, and I've told all of them the same thing. Get a good attorney, read what you sign, and keep the folder in the bottom drawer. Because the Brad Lawsons of the world, the Crofts, they will always exist. They will always arrive with their frameworks and their certainty and their willingness to dismiss what they don't understand. Most of the time they win, because most people are protected, and most people don't know they aren't protected until it's too late. I was protected, not because I saw it coming. Because a long time ago I did the work. That's the only revenge that ever actually matters. Not the invoice, not the retainer, not walking back in with a visitor badge. It's the 11-year-old contract sitting in a bottom drawer quietly waiting. I wrote the manual. They were using it without understanding it. In the end, that's the whole story. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that story. Not the invoice, not the retainer, not the licensing deal. Those are just numbers. What actually happened is that a man who spent 22 years learning something real ran into a man who had spent a few years learning how to talk about things. And for a moment, the talker won. That's not unusual. That happens every day in every industry. The talker often wins in the short run because organizations reward confidence and punish complexity. And what I did for that company was complex in ways that didn't fit on a slide deck. Croft wasn't stupid. I want to be honest about that. He was smart enough to build a paper trail, smart enough to manage upward, smart enough to survive inside the particular ecosystem that PE-backed companies create. What he wasn't was wise, and I think that's the distinction that matters. Intelligence gets you into rooms. Wisdom tells you what you don't know before you start breaking things. He walked into a system he didn't understand and called it broken because he couldn't read it. That's not a character flaw exactly. It's a failure of intellectual honesty. The most dangerous thing a smart person can do is stop asking whether they might be wrong. I didn't protect myself because I saw Croft coming. I protected myself because my attorney, 11 years before any of this happened, sat across from me and said, "Assume this relationship ends badly and make sure you're covered when it does." That's not cynicism. That's just how you operate when you take your work seriously. You document it. You value it correctly. You make sure the agreements reflect reality. I had done the work, and the work had value, and the clause in Section 9 was just the written acknowledgement of something that was already true. The thing about cause and effect, the real version, not a tidy moral lesson, is that it's slow. Croft made a decision on a Thursday afternoon that felt clean and efficient and modern. The consequences of that decision took weeks to become visible, and by then he was already defending himself internally for the mess he'd created. Every shortcut has a downstream. Every decision to dismiss what you don't understand creates a gap that eventually costs someone something. In his case, it cost the company close to $1 million and months of operational pain. In mine, it cost 2 years of accumulated work being called Dinosaur logistics by someone who couldn't have built a single piece of it. What I keep coming back to is this. Integrity in professional life isn't about being loyal to institutions. Institutions will reorganize around you without a second thought. Integrity means being honest about what you actually know, doing the work at the level it deserves, and protecting what you've built, not out of ego, but because the work is real and the work has value and you owe it to yourself to treat it that way. My wife asked me once during those weeks if I was angry. I told her I was tired. Anger requires you to be surprised. I wasn't surprised. I was just someone who had read his contract, done his work, and waited for the math to catch up. It always does.